In the shadow of America's major airlines, a smaller network of regional carriers quietly moves millions of passengers every year. Turboprops, short hops, tight schedules, most flights land safely. But when things go wrong on these smaller aircraft, the disasters are just as devastating. From a captain who froze at the controls during an ice storm, to a plane that took off from the wrong runway in the dark. These are the forgotten tragedies of America's commuter airlines. In this video, we're covering 10 of the worst regional and commuter crashes in American history. Wrong runways, metal fatigue, and deadly ice. If you're interested in aviation history and the real stories behind how we fly safer today, don't forget to subscribe. On the night of February 12, 2009, a commuter flight left Newark for Buffalo. On the schedule, it was Continental Connection Flight 3407, operated by Colgan Air. The airplane was a Bombardier Q400, a high-wing regional turboprop built to carry around 70 people on short hops between hubs in smaller cities. In the cabin, 49 people settled in for a winter evening flight. Travelers heading home, families, professionals. Outside, upstate New York weather was typical for February. Light snow, icing in the air, but nothing beyond what the Q400 was built to handle. The part no one in the cabin could see was fatigue. The captain had spent the previous night dozing in a crew room. The first officer had commuted overnight from the West Coast and tried to sleep wherever she could. Both were legal under the rules at the time, but far from rested. After a delay, the turboprop departed Newark and climbed toward Buffalo on autopilot. As they approached western New York, the airplane descended into cloud, picked up ice on the wings, and the crew switched on the de-icing system. In the cockpit, they chatted about pay, career plans, and being sick. It sounded like a normal conversation, but their attention to speed and configuration was not what it needed to be on a night approach in winter weather. Vectors brought them onto the approach for Buffalo. The autopilot stayed on. The airplane was stable, but as the captain called for flaps and the landing gear, drag increased and the speed slowly slid down. No one called it out. No one said, "Watch the speed." Then the protection systems woke up. The stall warning, the stick shaker, shook the controls to tell the crew the wings were at a dangerous angle and needed less pitch and more power. A moment later, the stick pusher, which automatically nudges the nose down to break a stall, kicked in. The correct response to that first warning is simple and drilled in training. Push the nose down, add full power, level the wings, except losing some altitude to get the wing flying again. Instead, the captain did almost the opposite. Startled by the shaker, he pulled back, raising the nose and increasing the angle of attack. Power came up, but now the turboprop was nose high, dirty, slow, and working against extra G-forces. When the stick pusher tried to lower the nose, he pulled against it. At the same time, the first officer retracted the flaps without a clear command, which raised the stall speed at the worst possible moment. Instead of recovering from the stall, they deepened it. From there, it took only seconds. The aircraft rolled sharply left, then right, then pitched nose down and fell out of the clouds. At 10:17 p.m., about 5 miles short of the runway, it slammed into a house in the suburb of Clarence Center, exploded, and burned. All 49 people on board died. Inside the house, one resident was killed. Others escaped. Fire crews found a residential street lit by a burning airliner wrapped around what had been a family home. When investigators downloaded the recorders and rebuilt the flight, they found icing, but not the extreme kind that would make the aircraft uncontrollable by itself. The engines were working. The de-icing system was on. The autopilot had kept the airplane on course until it disconnected at the first stall warning. The key break in the chain was human. A crew that let the speed decay, did not notice the warnings building, and then reacted to the stall in the wrong way. The final report focused on 3 failures: basic airmanship, inadequate training, and fatigue. The crew let airspeed decay, ignored warning signs, and mishandled the stall recovery. Colgan's stall training didn't prepare pilots for a low-altitude stall in a turboprop, and the airline allowed autopilot use in icing when hand flying would have given better feedback. Long commutes, low pay, and a system that tolerated tired crews with incomplete knowledge of their aircraft all contributed to the accident. For the families of the victims, it became a campaign. They went to Washington again and again, pushing lawmakers and regulators not to let this be just another accident. Their pressure helped trigger some of the biggest changes in modern U.S. airline rules: tougher stall recovery training, stricter duty and rest limits, and the requirement that most airline first officers now hold an airline transport pilot license, with far more flight time and training than many regional pilots had before 2009. Colgan Air Flight 3407 is often called the last major U.S. airline crash. More important than that label is what it showed: that a short regional hop in ordinary winter weather can still end in a house on fire when fatigue, weak training, and a few seconds of wrong instinct line up over a sleeping suburb. On the morning of January 8, 2003, a small U.S. Airways Express flight was getting ready to leave Charlotte, North Carolina, for Greenville-Spartanburg in South Carolina. On the paperwork, it was Air Midwest Flight 5481. The airplane was a Beech 19-seat commuter plane, working a short hop that business travelers and locals used all the time. There were 19 passengers and 2 pilots on board. The crew that day were both young but experienced on the type. The captain, Catherine Katie Leslie, was 25, and the youngest captain at the airline. The first officer, Jonathan Gibbs, was 27. They had flown this route many times. Outside, the weather was calm and clear winter morning air. No storms, no icing, no drama in the sky. At the gate in Charlotte, ramp agents loaded 23 checked bags into the rear cargo area, including a couple that were unusually heavy. The pilots calculated the weight and balance using standard passenger averages that were approved by the Federal Aviation Administration, numbers that had not really been updated since the 1930s. On paper, the aircraft was within limits. In reality, people were heavier than the old tables assumed, and that difference mattered. Just after 8:45 in the morning, flight was cleared for takeoff on runway 18 right. The commuter plane accelerated, lifted off, and immediately began to pitch nose up far more than normal. Within seconds, it was climbing at a very steep angle. Both pilots pushed forward on their control columns, trying to lower the nose, but the airplane did not respond the way it should. The stall warning horn sounded. The nose kept coming up. The aircraft reached about 1,000 feet, then stalled, rolled, and dropped almost straight ahead. Around 37 seconds after liftoff, it slammed into the corner of a U.S. Airways maintenance hangar and burst into flames. Everyone on board died. One mechanic on the ground was injured by smoke. The National Transportation Safety Board pulled the recorders and traced the failure back to 2 critical errors. 2 nights before the crash, mechanics at a contract facility in Huntington, West Virginia, had adjusted the elevator control cables. The work was done by a trainee who had never worked on this aircraft type, supervised by a trainer who was also the quality control inspector. They skipped steps in the official procedure and never performed a proper post-maintenance check. The result, the elevator system no longer had full nose-down travel. The pilots could push, but the tail couldn't generate enough force to bring the nose down. At the same time, investigators reconstructed the actual weights of passengers and bags and found the aircraft had been about 580 pounds over its maximum takeoff weight, with its center of gravity roughly 5% beyond the aft limit. That combination, improper rigging plus an aft heavy load, put the airplane outside its controllable envelope the moment it left the ground. The NTSB's conclusion was direct. The excessive aft center of gravity, coupled with reduced elevator authority from incorrect rigging, rendered the airplane uncontrollable in pitch. Out of this small, short flight came big changes. The aviation authorities moved to update average passenger weight assumptions and pushed airlines, especially small carriers, to use more realistic figures. Air Midwest and the maintenance contractor overhauled their procedures, and the industry got a very public reminder that independent inspections cannot be done by the same person who trained the mechanic and signed off the work. Just before sunrise on August 27, 2006, a Delta Connection flight sat at the end of the taxiway in Lexington, Kentucky. On the schedule, it was Comair Flight 5191, a short hop from Bluegrass Airport to Atlanta. The airplane was a Bombardier CRJ-100, a small regional jet with 50 seats, the kind of commuter aircraft that links smaller cities to big hubs all over the United States. On board were 47 passengers and 3 crew members. The weather was clear and calm. It was still dark, but visibility was good and there was no fog or rain. Inside the cockpit, Captain Jeffrey Clay and First Officer James Polhinky prepared for departure. The captain would taxi. The first officer would fly the takeoff. In the cabin, most passengers were likely half asleep, expecting a routine early morning flight that would put them in Atlanta in time for connections and work. Bluegrass Airport had 2 paved runways. Airline traffic was supposed to use runway 22, more than 7,000 feet long. A smaller, older strip, runway 26, crossed near one end. It was just 3,500 feet long, unlit, and not approved for commercial jet departures. The controller in the tower cleared Comair 5191 to taxi and take off from runway 22. The crew read back the clearance correctly. On paper, everything was standard. While they taxied, the cockpit voice recorder captured something else. Casual talk about their careers, other airports, and the early hour. None of this was evil or dramatic, but it broke the sterile cockpit rule, which says that below 10,000 feet and during critical phases like taxi and takeoff, conversation should stay focused on the flight. As they rolled along the taxiway, that focus slipped. Construction work at the airport had changed some of the pavement markings and lighting in the months before the accident. The main taxiway no longer led straight to the threshold of runway 22. Instead, it passed the end of runway 26 first, then curved toward the longer runway. In the darkness, the captain turned onto the first strip he reached. That was runway 26, the short one. The centerline lights of runway 22 were on. Runway 26 had no centerline lights at all. As the jet lined up, the first officer commented, "That "That is weird, with no lights," the captain agreed. It was a clear cue that something was wrong. But neither pilot stopped to cross-check their position against the airport diagram, the heading on their instruments, or the signs they had just passed. No one called the tower to ask why the runway was dark. With the clock ticking toward their scheduled departure, they continued. The regional jet began its takeoff roll. Acceleration felt normal at first, but the short runway was running out far faster than the pilots expected. Based on the airplane's weight, the manufacturer calculated that they needed more than 3,700 feet just to reach rotation speed, and more runway beyond that to actually lift off. Runway 26 was only about 3,500 feet long from threshold to end. There simply was not enough pavement. The first officer advanced the thrust, called the speeds, and pulled back on the control column at the proper number. The airplane's nose began to rise, but the jet was already at the far end of the runway. It ran off the pavement, struck a low earthen berm, became briefly airborne, clipped the perimeter fence, then smashed into trees in a hill about 1,000 feet beyond the runway end. The impact tore the fuselage apart and ignited the fuel. Within seconds, the quiet field beside the airport was lit by burning wreckage. Inside the cabin, most people died instantly from the forces of the crash. The only survivor was First Officer Polhinka, badly injured and pulled from the wreck under intense heat by rescuers. All 47 passengers and the captain and flight attendant were killed. For Lexington, it was the worst aviation disaster in local memory. News coverage showed twisted metal in a blackened field, firefighters working in the dawn light, and friends and relatives gathering at the terminal for updates that would not bring good news. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation found no sign of mechanical failure or problems with the jet's engines or brakes. The weather had been fine. The controller had issued a correct clearance for runway 22, but after clearing Comair 5191 for takeoff, he turned away from the window to handle other duties and did not see the jet depart from the wrong strip. The core of the story was simple and uncomfortable. Two qualified pilots had taxied onto the wrong runway and then failed to catch the mistake even when the clues were right in front of them. In its final report, the NTSB said the probable cause was the flight crew's failure to use available cues and aids to identify their position on the airport surface and to verify that they were on the correct runway before takeoff. Contributing factors included their non-essential conversation during taxi, which led to a loss of situational awareness, and the Federal Aviation Administration's practice at Bluegrass of having only one controller on duty to handle both tower and radar functions during that overnight shift. The board also noted that the controller had slept only a couple of hours before his shift, although it could not prove that fatigue directly affected his performance. On October 31, 1994, American Eagle Flight 4184 lifted off from Indianapolis bound for Chicago O'Hare, operated by Simmons Airlines. The airplane was an ATR-72, a French-Italian regional turboprop with around 70 seats. On board were 64 passengers and 4 crew members. The captain, Orlando Aguilar, had thousands of hours of experience, including more than 1,500 on the ATR. First Officer Jeffrey Galliano had over 5,000 hours. By regional standards, this was an experienced crew. Weather around Chicago was poor. Low clouds, cold, wet air moving across northern Indiana and Illinois. Classic autumn icing weather, a shallow layer of air just below freezing, with drizzle that could turn to ice on contact with an airplane. The ATR was certified to handle it, as long as crews followed procedures. Because of traffic and weather, Chicago Air Traffic Control put arrivals into holding patterns. The flight was told to enter a hold near Roselawn, Indiana, and wait. The turboprop leveled off in the clouds, flying circles through freezing drizzle. As they held, ice began building on the wings. The crew followed standard procedures and set the de-icing system to a higher level. Boots on the leading edges inflated and deflated in cycles, cracking and shedding ice. What the crew couldn't see was that conditions were slightly different that day. The drops were larger than normal, supercooled large droplet icing that forms not only on the leading edge, but farther back behind the area covered by the boots. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was relaxed. The autopilot was on. The crew talked with a flight attendant, mentioned the ice a few times, but sensed no emergency. To stay ahead of speed limits, they selected flaps 15 while still in the hold, something the manual allowed. After about 40 minutes, air traffic control cleared the flight to leave the hold and start down toward Chicago. The first officer flew, the captain monitored. Power came back, the turboprop descended through about 10,000 feet, still in cloud, still in icing. Airspeed was near the upper limit for flaps 15. The de-icing system was at its highest setting. Everything looked normal. Then, in seconds, it all changed. As the crew began retracting the flaps from 15 degrees back toward zero, that small change in the wing's shape disturbed the ice ridge that had formed behind the leading edge. Aerodynamic tests later showed that on this wing design, with ice beyond the boots, certain flap movements could suddenly reverse the way the ailerons behaved. Instead of the controls naturally centering, the forces could flip and drive a wing down without warning. That's what happened over Roselawn. As the flaps moved and the aircraft descended through about 9,000 feet, the ATR suddenly rolled hard to the right, far steeper than anything commanded. The autopilot disconnected. The first officer tried to correct with opposite aileron and rudder. For a brief moment, they brought the wings closer to level. Then the airplane snapped into another, more violent roll and pitched down. In the cabin, passengers felt a sharp tilt, then a shocking drop and sideways lurch. On the recorders, investigators later heard rising stress in the crew's voices, the stall warning, the ground proximity alerts, and then loud impacts. Flight 4184 plunged nose down into a soybean field near Roselawn at very high speed. The impact was unsurvivable. The airplane disintegrated, leaving wreckage scattered across wet, muddy ground. All 68 people on board were killed. When the National Transportation Safety Board dug into the data, they found no evidence of mechanical failure before the final seconds. Instead, they focused on the combination of icing, wing design, and certification. The ATR's wing produced strong changes in aileron forces when ice formed behind the boots. In the conditions over Indiana, the standard de-icing system couldn't prevent that dangerous ice ridge from forming farther back. The board's final report concluded the airplane had lost control because of unexpected aileron behavior caused by ice accreting beyond the de-icing boots. Aileron hinge moment reversal, meaning the wing began to tell the ailerons to move the wrong way. Investigators criticized the manufacturer and regulators for not fully understanding, testing, and communicating the risk, despite previous incidents that had hinted at the problem. For families, technical terms about droplets and airfoils didn't blunt the shock. This had been an ordinary regional flight on a cold, gray afternoon. For the industry, it was a wake-up call that approved for icing doesn't always mean safe in every kind of ice. On the evening of November 19, 1996, a small United Express flight made its last leg toward a quiet Midwestern airport. United Express Flight 5925, operated by Great Lakes Airlines with a 19-seat Beechcraft commuter plane. It had left Chicago O'Hare, stopped once in Burlington, Iowa, and was now descending toward Quincy Municipal Airport in western Illinois. On board were 10 passengers and 2 pilots, Captain Kate Gathje and First Officer Darren McCombs. Quincy was not a big hub. It was a non-towered airport, which means there was no controller watching the runways from a tower. Pilots used a shared radio frequency, called a common traffic advisory frequency, to tell each other where they were and what they planned to do. It was a system built on habit and politeness. You say your position, you listen carefully, and you scan outside for other airplanes. That evening, 2 other aircraft were also getting ready to depart. One was a small Piper Cherokee. Behind it was a business turboprop, a Beech King Air. Both planned to take off from runway 04. The United Express flight, arriving from the southwest, was cleared for runway 13. The 2 runways crossed near the middle of the field. Any mistake about who was where would be resolved, or not, at that intersection. As the flight descended, the crew called on the common frequency, asking how the departures wanted to work the sequence. In simple terms, they were asking, "Are you going to go now, or wait for us to land and clear the runway?" There was no immediate answer from the King Air. A little later, as they came on to final, they asked again. This time, a voice came back from the Cherokee, saying in effect that it would hold short of runway 04. Inside the cockpit, that reply was clipped by a chime from the ground proximity warning system at 200 feet. The recorder later showed that only part of the Cherokee's transmission actually made it into their headsets. What they clearly heard was, "We'll hold short." They didn't hear the call sign. In their minds, that line became a general promise that both airplanes at the end of runway 04 would wait while they landed and rolled through the intersection. Out on the ground, the situation was different. The King Air's pilots either didn't hear the full exchanges or didn't understand them as applying to their departure. They focused on their own takeoff. They taxied onto runway 04, turned into position, and began their roll. At the same time, the United Express flight came down final for runway 13, confident that the intersection ahead would be empty. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the commuter plane touched down on runway 13. The captain called for maximum reverse thrust and began slowing the aircraft. Through the twilight, she suddenly saw bright landing lights moving toward them from the right, down runway 04. The King Air was already accelerating through the intersection. On the cockpit voice recorder, you hear a sharp exclamation as she slams on the brakes. The first officer reacts a heartbeat later, realizing what he's seeing. There's no time for a radio call. The 2 airplanes met at the crossing point of the runways. The King Air's nose and right wing sliced into the left side of the commuter plane near the wing and fuselage. Both aircraft spun and slid off the paved surface, coming to rest near runway 13, already leaking fuel. Fire broke out almost immediately. From the terminal and hangars, people saw a flash, then a growing fire at the runway intersection. The impact itself was survivable for everyone on the United Express flight. All 12 people on board were alive after the collision. They were battered and thrown around, but the cabin remained mostly intact. The problem was getting out. The main exit was a built-in air stair door at the front left side. The crash forces had jammed and twisted it in its frame. Passengers tried to open it. The crew tried to open it. It didn't move. Some attempted to force the small overwing exits, but with the aircraft tilted and filling with smoke, those too were difficult and unfamiliar. Pilots from other airplanes on the ground raced to the wreckage. They reached the commuter plane quickly, in street clothes, without fire gear. They tried the outside handle on the main door and couldn't open it. They pounded on the fuselage, shouted to the people inside, and fought with the hardware as the smoke thickened and flames grew. There was no fully equipped aircraft rescue and firefighting service on the field. The local fire department took several minutes to arrive. By the time they could attack the fire, it was far too late for the people trapped behind that jammed door. Everyone on Flight 5925 and both pilots of the King Air died from smoke inhalation and burns. When the National Transportation Safety Board reconstructed the accident, the broad outline was clear. United Express 5925 had landed on runway 13 as planned. The King Air had begun a takeoff roll on runway 04 at the same time. Neither crew had a controller to separate them. The only tools were radios and eyes. The board found the primary cause was the King Air pilot's failure to effectively monitor the common frequency and to properly scan for traffic before starting their takeoff. Contributing factors included the Cherokee pilot's interrupted transmission, which led the United Express crew to believe both airplanes would hold short, and the lack of adequate firefighting and rescue capability at the airport, which turned an impact that everyone initially survived into a total loss of life. The design of the commuter plane's air stair door, which jammed in the accident, also came under serious criticism. The Quincy runway collision triggered recommendations on several fronts. Training materials for non-towered airports were updated to stress more active scanning outside the cockpit, clearer phraseology on shared frequencies, and the need to positively identify which airplane is speaking before assuming anything about right-of-way. Regulators and manufacturers looked again at emergency exits on small regional aircraft and at the level of firefighting protection at airports that host scheduled commercial service, even without control towers. On August 21, 1995, another Delta Connection commuter flight rolled away from the gate in Atlanta, heading for the Gulf Coast. Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529, a short hop from Hartsfield to Gulfport, Biloxi in Mississippi. The airplane was an Embraer Brasilia, a twin-engine regional turboprop with 30 seats. On board were 26 passengers and 3 crew members. In the cockpit, Captain Ed Ganaway, 45, had nearly 10,000 hours of flight time and more than 7,000 on the Brasilia. Beside him, First Officer Matt Warmerdam was newer to the airline, but current and qualified. In the cabin, Flight Attendant Robin Fetch worked alone. The passenger list was typical for a weekday regional. Business travelers, engineers, law enforcement officers, a minister, a woman on her way to start flight attendant training. The flight left the ramp around 12:10 in the afternoon and took off a little after 12:20. Climb out from Atlanta was routine. The turboprop pointed west and began climbing toward cruising level. There were no storms, no icing, nothing unusual in the weather. About 20 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through roughly 18,000 feet, everyone on board heard a sudden, violent bang. Warmerdam later said it sounded like someone hitting a metal trash can with a baseball bat. The Brasilia shuddered. The nose yawed hard to the left, the cockpit filled with vibration and noise. Outside, something critical had happened. A section of one blade on the left propeller had broken off in flight. The separation threw the propeller badly out of balance. The violent wobbling bent and tore the left engine nacelle, twisted the wing's leading edge, and destroyed the smooth airflow over that side of the aircraft. This wasn't a simple engine failure, where one engine quits and the other keeps flying. The left engine was still attached, but now it was a massive source of drag and disturbed lift. In the cockpit, alarms lit up. Captain Ganaway and First Officer Warmerdam fought to keep the airplane under control. They shut down the damaged engine, feathered what was left of the propeller, and turned back toward Atlanta. It quickly became clear they weren't going to make it. The drag from the broken nacelle and damaged wing was too much. The turboprop kept losing altitude. They declared an emergency and were vectored instead toward the nearer West Georgia Regional Airport at Carrollton. While the pilots worked the problem, the cabin was changing fast. The airplane was shaking, slipping sideways. Fetch moved up and down the aisle, shouting a quick, clear briefing over the noise. How to brace, when to open the exits, what to do after impact. The National Transportation Safety Board would later single out her performance as one of the reasons anyone survived. In the cockpit, Ganaway and Warmerdam tried to nurse the airplane toward any kind of runway, but the descent rate kept increasing as the left wing produced less lift and the deformed nacelle acted like a giant air brake. They lowered the landing gear to stabilize the airplane and started searching for open fields. West Georgia Regional was still just out of reach. The only option was a forced landing in farmland near the small community of Burwell. They lined up with a sloping hayfield and tried to bring the Brasilia in under some control. The approach was rough. At the last moment, the airplane pitched nose down, clipped trees, and hit the ground hard in a left-wing low attitude. The crash tore off the weakened wing, broke the fuselage, and dumped the cabin onto the field. Fuel tanks ruptured. Within about a minute, fire spread along the wreckage. Remarkably, everyone except the captain survived the initial impact. Some passengers were able to unbuckle, stand up, and move toward exits even as smoke and flames grew. Fetch, with a broken wrist and other injuries, kept pushing people out of the cabin. Outside, local residents and emergency crews raced to the site and began pulling survivors away from the wreck as the fire intensified. The tragedy didn't end on that field. Several badly burned passengers died in the hours and days that followed. In total, 9 people, Captain Ganaway and 8 passengers, eventually lost their lives. 20 others were injured, many severely. When investigators recovered the missing piece of propeller blade weeks later in a field miles from the crash site, the picture became clearer. Microscopic examination showed metal fatigue and corrosion pits in the aluminum alloy. That blade had failed from the inside out. It had even been flagged and removed during a previous inspection, then refurbished and returned to service using procedures that turned out to be flawed. The NTSB's final report said the probable cause was the in-flight fatigue fracture and separation of a propeller blade, leading to distortion of the engine nacelle, excessive drag, loss of lift on the left wing, and reduced directional control. Investigators sharply criticized the propeller manufacturer for inadequate inspection and repair practices, weak training and documentation, and the failure to require recurring ultrasonic inspections that might have caught the defect earlier. Flight 529 also highlighted something else: how much difference a few people can make once the accident has already begun. Warmerdam survived with devastating burns after using a cockpit axe to cut his way out through the windshield. Passengers later recalled Fetch's calm, direct commands in the cabin as the fire spread. Both were later honored for their actions, and both spent years dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath. In the years that followed, propeller systems like the one on the Brasilia were redesigned, inspection intervals were tightened, and regulators paid much closer attention to how complex components are overhauled and returned to service. Every time a prop blade is scanned for hidden cracks, or a worn component is scrapped instead of polished and sent back out, there's a line back to a summer day over Georgia, a sudden bang at 18,000 feet, and 9 minutes in which a small commuter airplane fought to stay in the sky. On the evening of October 19, 2004, a small commuter flight left St. Louis for the college town of Kirksville, Missouri. On the schedule, it was Corporate Airlines Flight 5966, flying under the American Connection brand. The airplane was a British Aerospace Jetstream 32, a twin-engine turboprop with just 19 seats, the kind of regional aircraft that feeds small communities into the big airline networks. On board were 13 passengers and 2 pilots. Several of those passengers were doctors flying in for a medical seminar at A.T. Still University in Kirksville. Among them was Dr. Stephen Z. Miller, a pediatric emergency physician from New York and a leading voice in humanism in medicine. Others were local business travelers and staff heading home. For them, this was a quiet, late-evening hop across Missouri, less than an hour in the air. The captain, 48-year-old Kim Sassi, was an experienced pilot and former instructor with more than 4,000 flight hours, over half of them on the jet stream. The first officer, 29-year-old Jonathan Palmer, was also a former instructor with nearly 3,000 hours, but only around 100 hours on this particular type. It was a small airline cockpit. 2 people doing everything from radio calls to approach briefings without the layers of support you see on a major airline widebody. By the time Flight 5966 neared Kirksville, night had fully settled in. Low clouds, light rain, and haze hung over the rolling farmland of northern Missouri. The crew was cleared for a non-precision instrument approach to runway 36 at Kirksville Regional Airport. That kind of approach gives lateral guidance to the runway, but no glide slope. Pilots have to manage their own descent and must not go below a published minimum descent altitude, unless they have clear visual references for the runway environment. That limit is there for a simple reason. Below it, obstacle clearance is no longer. The jet stream intercepted the final approach course and started down. In the cockpit, the voice recorder later revealed long stretches of casual talk, jokes, and comments unrelated to the flight. As they got closer, both pilots began looking outside, trying to pick out the airport lights through the murk. What you do not hear are the standard callouts, altitude checks, reminders of the minimum descent altitude, the cross-checking rhythm that keeps one pilot flying and the other monitoring. They descended through the minimum descent altitude without a firm visual picture of the runway. Regulations at the time allowed pilots to continue a little lower if they could see certain approach lights, even if the full runway was not yet visible. In practice, it is a dangerous gray zone. The lights are faint, depth perception is poor, and it is very easy to sink too far, too soon, on a dark night. The jet stream continued down, still in cloud and haze, with both pilots focused more on the thin line of lights outside than on the altimeter in front of them. On the ground, witnesses saw the aircraft's landing lights suddenly emerge low over the trees, not on the runway centerline, but off to the side. A moment later, the jet stream began striking treetops about 1 to 1.3 miles short of the threshold of runway 36. The impact with the trees tore at the wings and fuselage, pitching the airplane down. It crashed in a wooded area and burst into flames. 13 people, including both pilots, were killed. 2 passengers survived with serious injuries and later described clawing their way out of a broken cabin into the burning woods. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation found no evidence of engine failure, structural breakup, or navigation equipment problems before the impact. Night instrument conditions existed at the time of the crash, and the aircraft was exactly where it should have been laterally for the approach. The issue was vertical. The crew had simply flown the airplane too low, too early, in controlled flight, until it hit the trees. This is the textbook definition of controlled flight into terrain. The probable cause, in the board's words, was the pilot's failure to follow established procedures and properly conduct a non-precision instrument approach at night in instrument meteorological conditions, including descending below the minimum descent altitude before they had the required visual cues. They also failed to maintain the normal division of duties between the flying and monitoring pilot. Contributing factors included their failure to make standard callouts, their unprofessional cockpit behavior, and fatigue, which likely degraded their performance. The board also pointed a finger at the regulations that allowed descent below the minimum altitude based only on seeing approach lights without full runway visibility in an area where obstacle clearance was not assured. On the afternoon of December 19, 2005, one of the most unusual airliners in the United States skimmed across the water in Miami. Chalk's Ocean Airways Flight 101, a seaplane service that had been running from Florida to the Bahamas for generations. That day's flight was a short hop from Miami to Bimini. On board were 18 passengers and 2 pilots in a vintage Grumman Turbo Mallard, an amphibious flying boat that took off and landed on water instead of runways. Most of the passengers were Bahamian islanders heading home from Christmas shopping in South Florida. Some carried bags full of gifts. 3 were infants sitting on the laps of their parents. The pilots were Captain Michelle Marks, 37, and First Officer Paul DeSanctis, 34, both experienced on the route and familiar with the old seaplane. The airplane itself was a survivor from another era. It had been built in 1947 and later converted from piston engines to modern turboprops. By the time of the accident, it had flown more than 31,000 hours and over 39,000 cycles, lifting off from water thousands of times around Miami and the islands. Chalks had kept it going by buying other old Mallards and using them for spare parts, because no one built aircraft like this anymore. Just before 3 in the afternoon, Flight 101 lined up on the smooth water at the Miami seaplane base near the port of Miami. Weather was clear and bright. Tourists on nearby boats and people on shore watched the white seaplane pick up speed, rise onto its floats, and lift away toward the channel known as Government Cut, the waterway that connects the port to the open Atlantic. Within about a minute of takeoff, something was clearly wrong. Witnesses saw white smoke or mist trailing from the right wing. Some thought it was fuel. Others just saw spray coming off the airplane where nothing should be coming off. Then, in a moment captured on a tourist's camcorder, the entire right wing separated from the fuselage. The wing and the rest of the airplane continued forward for a heartbeat as two separate pieces. Then the fuselage rolled, pitched nose down, and plunged into the water. The detached wing, burning, fell separately nearby. The seaplane hit the channel at high speed and broke apart. There were no survivors. Boats rushed in from all directions. Police, Coast Guard, harbor pilots, private vessels. Divers and rescuers pulled bodies and debris from the water surrounded by floating luggage and fuel. Government Cut was shut down, trapping cruise ships in port, while investigators converged on the scene. For the National Transportation Safety Board, the basic outline was clear from the first day. The right wing had come off in flight. The hard part was understanding why. The Turbo Mallard had been flying a normal departure profile. Weather was good. There was no evidence of an explosion or mid-air collision. Engines and controls had been working until the moment the wing failed. That pointed investigators straight to the airplane's structure and its maintenance history. The Mallard used what's called a wet wing. Instead of separate fuel tanks inside the wing structure itself forms the walls of the tank. That saves weight, but means the metal skin and internal members both carry loads and hold fuel. Over tens of thousands of flights, wings on any airplane flex and bend. On a seaplane that pounds into waves every day, the stresses are even higher. If cracks start in a structural piece and aren't caught and repaired properly, they can grow silently until the metal can no longer carry the load. Investigators quickly learned that this airplane had a long history of fuel leaks from its wings. Mechanics had responded by repeatedly applying sealant inside the tanks and by installing metal patches, called doublers, over cracks in the lower wing skin near the root. Each doubler was supposed to spread loads around a damaged area. In this case, the patches didn't fix the underlying problem. They covered symptoms while a deeper crack in a key internal stringer, an important structural member running spanwise inside the wing, continued to grow out of sight. The board found that at some point before the accident, that stringer had actually fractured completely. With that hidden piece broken, the right wing was already significantly weakened. The visible crack in the skin and the need for ever longer patches were warning signs that the whole area was carrying more stress than it should. Yet the maintenance records and inspections treated each new leak and crack as a local issue, not as a clue to a larger structural problem. On the accident flight, the weakened structure finally reached its limit. As the seaplane climbed out over Government Cut, with normal aerodynamic loads on the wing, the stressed area near the root failed. The right wing separated, releasing fuel that ignited in the air. The remaining fuselage had no chance. At that low altitude and with half of its lift gone, it rolled and fell straight into the channel. The NTSB said the probable cause was the in-flight failure and separation of the right wing due to metal fatigue, made possible by Chalk's maintenance program, failing to detect and properly repair structural cracks. The board also cited the Federal Aviation Administration for not catching the airline's maintenance problems and for regulatory gaps that allowed older seaplanes like the Mallard to operate without the same level of structural oversight that newer transport aircraft receive. After the crash, Chalks grounded the rest of its Mallard fleet. Inspections found serious corrosion and questionable repairs on other airplanes as well. The airline, once famous as one of the world's oldest continuous carriers and a symbol of flying boats in Miami, never really recovered. Within a couple of years, it stopped operating altogether. In most of these stories, there was no headline plane, no wide body over an ocean, no famous airline on a long-haul route. These were the flights that leave from the far end of the terminal, 19 seats to a college town in Missouri. A turboprop into Buffalo on a winter night. A seaplane lifting off from Miami's harbor. For the people on board, they weren't regional or commuter flights. They were the only way to get home, to get to a conference, to connect a small town to the rest of the map. Doctors on their way to teach, islanders returning with Christmas shopping, families catching connections. When things went wrong, it was almost never a single dramatic failure. It was speed that decayed without anyone noticing, flaps moved at the wrong moment in icing, outdated weight numbers, a wrong turn on the taxiway, a radio call nobody fully heard, or a crack in old metal hidden under sealant. In Buffalo, a modern turboprop stalled over a quiet suburb because tired pilots fought the stall warning the wrong way. In Charlotte, a small Beechcraft left the ground overweight with misrigged controls. Over Indiana, ice beyond the boots turned a normal descent into a sudden roll. At Lexington, a regional jet accelerated down a runway too short for it to ever fly away from. Near Brunswick and Carrollton, propeller failures turned one side of an aircraft into pure drag. At Kirksville and Quincy, dark nights and missed cues turned safe approaches into controlled flight into terrain and a runway collision. In Miami, a seaplane's wing finally let go after decades of patchwork repairs. Each accident forced someone to change something. Training programs rewrote stall recovery procedures. Weight charts were updated. Icing procedures were tightened. Wrong runway accidents became standard case studies. Propeller systems and aging structures went under stricter scrutiny. Small airports were asked harder questions about emergency response. The passengers who died never saw those changes. Their families see them only as lines in a report and promises that it will be safer next time. But the next time does matter. Every time a regional crew calls unstable, going around instead of forcing a landing, every time a mechanic refuses to sign off a shortcut repair, every time a pilot at a small airport pauses at the hold short line to confirm the runway really matches the clearance, they're quietly breaking the same kind of chain that ran through these stories. It's easy to look at a small turboprop or a 19-seat commuter and think of it as just a little plane. The truth is that physics doesn't care about ticket prices or route length. The margins are just as unforgiving, and the lessons written in places like Clarence Center, Roselawn, Quincy, Kirksville, and Government Cut are now built into the systems that keep those flights safe. If you want to keep exploring what really happened on flights like these, and how each one changed the rules for everyone who flies, subscribe and leave a like. It helps keep these regional and commuter accidents from fading into a few lines on an old timetable.